The first time the Germans heard about it, they laughed. They called it an American fairy tale, the kind of rumor frightened pilots whisper when they're losing too many friends in the sky. A B-17 that wouldn't go down. A flying fortress that returned with holes in its wings big enough to crawl through, yet still landed like it was untouched. But what made them truly uneasy wasn't the aircraft itself. B-17s were everywhere by 1944. It was the crew, the same names, the same tail number. Again and again. And every time the Luftwaffe tried to kill it, something happened that didn't fit the rules of war. Something that felt wrong, because this bomber didn't just survive. It hunted back. In the cold archives of World War II combat records, there's a mission report that reads like a nightmare. 17 German planes were listed as destroyed during a single engagement, 17. The kind of number that belongs to a squadron, not one battered B-17 crawling through flak and fire. The official paperwork tried to spread the credit across escort fighters and multiple bombers, but the witness statements didn't match. Several pilots, American and German, described the same moment. A B-17 falling behind the formation, seemingly crippled, then turning into a trap. A slow-moving target that suddenly became a killing zone. A secret weapon hidden in plain sight. And once the Germans understood what it was, they didn't just try to shoot it down. They tried to erase it. Its records, its crew, its existence. Because the terrifying part wasn't the weapon. The terrifying part was that it was used like the crew wanted the enemy to come closer. By early 1944, the skies over Europe were no longer just a battlefield. They were a slaughterhouse. American bombers went in during daylight because the strategy demanded it. Precision. Terror. A message. But daylight also meant the Germans could see them clearly, and the Luftwaffe had learned exactly how to kill a B-17. They didn't have to destroy it with one clean shot. They only needed to cripple it, shoot an engine, tear a wing, rip the tail. A bomber that dropped out of formation became a floating coffin. That's where the fighters moved in, circling like wolves. They called those bombers stragglers. And once you became a straggler, the war didn't feel like a war anymore. It felt like an execution. The crew of this particular B-17 knew that. They had seen what happened to men who fell behind. Bodies falling through open bomb bay doors, parachutes catching fire, gunners screaming into frozen oxygen masks. The kind of death that didn't even leave a body to bury. And yet, mission after mission, this aircraft returned. Not clean, not lucky. Returned in a condition that made ground crews stare silently, because no one could understand how it was still flying. One wing would be shredded, the fuselage peppered like it had been dragged through a steel storm. Sometimes the tail section looked like it had been bitten, and the crew would climb out with blank faces. No celebration, no jokes, just a quiet, almost sick calm. Like men who had stopped believing they were alive. At first, the rumors said the plane had a charm. A lucky coin. A Bible in the cockpit. A saint's medal taped to the instrument panel. Those stories were common, because superstition spreads faster than truth when you're living on borrowed time. But this wasn't superstition. This was something more deliberate. Because after one mission, an oil refinery strike, an American escort pilot wrote something in his debrief that made the intelligence officers sit up straight. He said he saw the B-17 break formation, not from damage but on purpose. He said it slowed down, let German fighters swarm it, then he couldn't explain it. German aircraft began falling apart around it. Not like they were being shot from one direction, but like the air itself around the bomber had become lethal. The pilot wrote, "It was like that fortress had teeth. The B-17 had a nickname, but the records disagree on what it was. Some files list it as just a serial number. Some mention a nose art name that was later blacked out. In the unofficial whispers, it was called Blackjack, not because of the paint, but because people believed if you flew near it, your luck would turn." The crew was from the 8th Air Force, operating out of England. Most were young, barely past 20, but they carried themselves like older men. They didn't talk much in the mess hall. They didn't brag. They didn't chase the usual distractions. The ground crews didn't like them. Not because they were rude, because they were quiet in a way that made everyone uncomfortable, like they were hiding something that didn't belong in daylight. The first clue wasn't in a combat report. It was in a maintenance log. A mechanic noted that the plane's waist gun positions were modified. That alone wasn't unusual. Crews customized B-17s constantly, adding armor plates, moving guns, changing ammunition feeds. But the mechanic wrote something strange. He said the modifications weren't just for defense. They were arranged in a way that created overlapping fire patterns behind and below the bomber. A kill box. A trap. A design that assumed the plane would be attacked from a specific angle, and that the crew wanted that angle to happen. When the mechanic asked why, the crew chief told him to mind his own business. And then, As if to make sure he never asked again, the crew chief leaned close and said, "Because the next time they come in, we're taking them with us." And the mechanic never wrote another note. The next mission was scheduled like any other. Briefing room smoke, stale coffee, maps pinned to the wall, and a red line drawn deep into Germany like a knife wound. The target was a factory complex feeding the German war machine, the kind of place protected by flak so thick it looked like black weather. Everyone in the room knew what that meant. The bomber stream would be forced to hold steady through a storm of steel, and the moment any fortress slipped out of formation, the Luftwaffe would finish the job. But something was different this time. 2 intelligence officers were standing in the back, not talking, watching one crew only. The men of the B-17 with the blacked-out name. They didn't look nervous. They didn't look excited. They looked prepared, like men who had already accepted death and were simply choosing how expensive it would be for the enemy. When the briefing ended, the rest of the airmen filed out, joking, cursing, praying. That crew walked out in silence, and the last man to leave the room, the tail gunner, paused by the map for half a second. He stared at the red line into Germany, then tapped the board once with his knuckle like he was knocking on a coffin. That same morning, in a German airfield east of the Rhine, a fighter pilot named Oberleutnant Karl Heinemann received his own briefing. He was not a rookie. He was one of the men still alive after years of combat, which in 1944 made him a rare thing, almost an artifact. His unit had already learned the American patterns. B-17's flew in tight boxes, gunners covering each other, escorts circling like sharks. The only reliable kills came from isolating a bomber, attacking from blind spots and forcing it to fall away. But that day, the briefing officer added a new note. Heinemann was told there was a specific bomber, one aircraft, that had become a problem. The officer didn't call it by name. He called it a contagion. Heinemann laughed at first. The Luftwaffe had lost too many men to superstition already. Pilots were refusing certain missions, claiming bad luck. Some believed American bombers carried experimental armor. Others claimed the Americans were using invisible escort fighters. But Heinemann was a practical man. He believed in physics, in ammunition, in fuel, in blood. He signed the mission paper, strapped into his fighter, and climbed into the sky. He had no idea he was flying towards something that would follow him for the rest of his life. The bomber stream appeared like a moving city in the clouds. Hundreds of aircraft, sunlight flashing off metal skins, contrails stretching like white scars across the sky. From the German perspective, it was a monstrous sight. So many bombers that the horizon looked crowded. Heinemann and his squadron climbed to intercept altitude, the engine whining, the cockpit vibrating with power. He could see the escort fighters too, Mustangs and Thunderbolts, cutting around the formation, waiting to pounce on anyone who got too close. The first attacks were standard. German fighters hit the edges, firing in short bursts, then diving away. Flak bloomed below like black flowers. A B-17 on the left side of the formation took a direct hit and rolled slowly, losing altitude. Another began trailing smoke. Heinemann watched a fortress break apart mid-air, wings snapped, fuselage twisting, and for a moment he felt that familiar cold satisfaction. The Americans were bleeding. Then he saw it. A single B-17, not at the edge, but slightly behind the main box. It was flying lower than the others, almost like it was struggling. The left engine was coughing smoke. The plane was lagging, drifting backward into the danger zone where German fighters loved to hunt. It looked like an easy kill, exactly the kind of target that would pull attention away from the escorts and the main formation. And that's what made Heinemann suspicious. Because it wasn't falling fast enough. A truly crippled bomber dropped like a stone. This one was controlling its fall. Heinemann adjusted his approach, lining up behind and below, the classic angle to avoid the nose guns and dorsal turret. 2 other German fighters moved in with him. He could almost taste the kill. He imagined the bomber's tail gunner panicking, firing too early, wasting ammo. He imagined the waist gunners screaming into their oxygen masks. He imagined the bomber shuddering under his cannon fire. But the tail gunner didn't panic. The tail gunner waited. And the moment Heinemann crossed into firing range, the air behind the B-17 erupted. Not just from the tail gun, from somewhere else. A sudden, brutal stream of tracers carved through the space where Heinemann's wingman had been flying. The fighter didn't explode immediately. It jerked violently, as if punched by an invisible fist. Pieces tore off, control surfaces, part of the wing root. Then the plane rolled upside down and went into a spin. The pilot never even ejected. Heinemann saw the canopy flash once, then the fighter vanished into cloud. Heinemann's stomach tightened. That wasn't normal. The tail gunner alone could not do that at that angle, not that fast. The shots had come from lower and wider, as if the bomber had guns pointing into the blind spot that should have been safe. Heinemann broke away, climbing hard. His second wingman stayed in. A second later, the same thing happened. Tracers. Too precise, too dense. The second fighter's engine caught fire instantly. and the aircraft turned into a screaming torch. It fell away, leaving a black ribbon of smoke across the sky. 2 fighters gone in seconds, and the B-17 didn't even change course. It kept flying like it wanted more. The Luftwaffe pilots began to circle wider, trying to figure out what they were dealing with. The escorts were still busy elsewhere, tangled with German fighters near the main bomber box. This straggling B-17 had become a strange pocket of death, and for a moment, the German pilots hesitated. Hesitation was deadly in air combat, but so was arrogance. Heinemann watched the bomber carefully. Through his gun sight, he saw something that made his mouth go dry. The waist windows, normally open ports with a gun sticking out, looked different. Not just one gun, 2, on each side, and the positioning was wrong. They weren't aimed outward in a normal defensive pattern. They were angled slightly backward, overlapping the tail gunner's field of fire, a design meant to create a funnel, a trap that punished anyone who attacked from behind. Heinemann felt a flicker of anger. This was cheating. This was a bomber behaving like a fighter. But then he realized something worse. The B-17 was still smoking, still damaged, still falling behind. And yet it was baiting them. It was acting like a wounded animal that had learned how to kill wolves. Heinemann radioed his squadron. Do not attack from behind. Do not approach from below. This aircraft has additional fire. There was silence for a second. Then a voice answered, tense and mocking. Additional fire? It's a bomber, Carl. And then the voice cut off mid-sentence. Heinemann looked and saw that fighter, one of the most aggressive in the unit, had ignored the warning. He dove straight into the bomber's rear quarter, confident, hungry. The B-17's tail gun fired first. Then, the waist guns joined. Then, Heinemann swore later he would never forget this. Another gun opened up from somewhere that shouldn't exist. A stream of tracers rose from the underside of the bomber, from the belly. Not the standard ball turret firing downward. This was angled back, like a shotgun pointed at the pursuer. The German fighter disintegrated, not exploded. Disintegrated. The wings snapped, the fuselage tore, the cockpit vanished into fragments. For a half-second, Heinemann saw a human shape thrown out of the wreckage, tumbling end over end with no parachute. Then it was gone. Heinemann's hands were sweating inside his gloves. That wasn't just a modification. That was a system, and whoever built it had built it for one purpose, to massacre attackers. The German pilots tried to change tactics. They spread out and attacked from the front. Head-on attacks were dangerous, but sometimes the only way to kill a fortress quickly. They came in like arrows, cannons firing. The B-17's nose guns answered, and the sky turned into a flickering tunnel of bullets. One German fighter took hits and peeled away. Another clipped the bomber's wing and nearly collided. Heinemann came in last, aiming for the cockpit. One clean burst could end it. But as he closed, he saw the bomber's cockpit windows. And he saw faces. Not panic, not fear. He saw the pilot looking straight at him, calm as stone. And for the first time in his career, Heinemann felt something he had not felt since the war began. Not danger, not adrenaline. He felt hunted. He fired anyway. His cannon rounds stitched across the bomber's nose. Glass shattered. Metal peeled, but the B-17 did not fall. It held its line, as if it had been built from something heavier than aluminum. Heinemann flashed past, close enough to see the bomber's nose art, scratched, partially painted over, like someone had tried to hide it. And under the paint he saw a symbol, a black playing card, a spade. Heinemann climbed away, heart pounding. Behind him, the B-17 dropped another few feet, still trailing smoke, still falling behind, still inviting them. And then it happened. A cluster of German fighters, 7, maybe 8, ignored the warnings and rushed in together, thinking numbers would overwhelm it. They attacked from behind and below, the exact angle the bomber wanted. Heinemann watched helplessly as they entered the kill zone. The B-17 opened up, not with one gun, not with 2, with everything. A crossfire so thick it looked like the bomber was vomiting bullets. Tracers stitched the air into a net. The first fighter caught fire instantly. The second lost its tail. The third exploded as its fuel tank ignited. The fourth collided with debris. The fifth tried to pull up and was shredded. The sixth rolled, smoking, and vanished into cloud. The seventh and eighth. Heinemann couldn't even track them because the sky had become chaos. It was over in seconds. 7 fighters down, maybe 8. And the B-17, still alive, kept flying. When the engagement ended, the bomber stream continued toward the target and the escorts finally swung back, chasing the remaining German fighters away. But Heinemann didn't retreat immediately. He hovered at distance, watching the strange B-17 as it limped onward. He wanted to understand it. He wanted to know what it was. Then he saw something that chilled him more than the gunfire. The bomber's rear hatch opened. For a moment, Heinemann thought a man was going to jump, but instead, something small fell out, tumbling in the air, spinning like a coin. a metal object. Heinemann watched it drop, and a second later, it exploded. Not like a bomb, like a flare, a bright flash in the clouds. A signal. Heinemann's blood went cold, because the Americans were not just defending themselves, they were communicating. And suddenly, Heinemann understood. This wasn't a lucky plane. This wasn't a myth. This was a planned operation, something the Americans had built and deployed on purpose, using one bomber as bait to draw in fighters and erase them. A flying execution trap, a weapon disguised as a wounded fortress. By the time Heinemann landed back at his airfield, the mood was dead. Mechanics moved quietly. Officers didn't shout. The pilots who returned avoided each other's eyes. The squadron had lost too many men in one encounter. The official tally would be adjusted later, hidden inside paperwork and scattered across reports. But everyone there knew what they had witnessed. And in the debrief room, when Heinemann described the B-17 and its extra guns, the intelligence officer didn't look surprised. He looked tired, like he'd been waiting for this confirmation. Heinemann demanded to know what it was. The officer didn't answer directly. He simply slid a folder across the table. Inside were photos, grainy reconnaissance shots of a B-17 on the ground in England. The nose art was blurred, the tail number partially obscured, but the modifications were visible. Extra gun mounts, reinforced armor, and something else, something under the belly, a shape that didn't belong. A second turret, not American standard, not British, something improvised, something stolen. Heinemann stared at the photos until his eyes burned. Then the officer said quietly, "This aircraft is not to be engaged alone anymore. It is to be destroyed by flak or by mass attack from multiple angles. If it appears, you retreat and call for heavy batteries." Heinemann felt rage. Retreat? From a bomber? But then the officer added the final line, soft, almost like a prayer. Because if you chase it, it will take you. That night, Heinemann couldn't sleep. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the moment the fighter disintegrated. Not exploding, not burning, just torn apart by a crossfire that shouldn't exist. And he realized the worst part wasn't the guns. The worst part was the crew, because only a certain kind of man could fly a bomber like that. A man who wasn't trying to survive. A man who was trying to kill as many as possible before he died. And Heinemann knew, with a sick certainty, that this wasn't the end. Because the Americans had built a trap, and traps are never used only once. 2 days after the massacre in the clouds, the Americans flew again. Not because they wanted to, because the war didn't pause for fear. The bomber crews kept climbing into metal coffins. The ground crews kept patching holes with rivets and prayers. And the commanders kept drawing red lines deeper into Germany. But this time, something was different at the airfield in England. The B-17 with the blacked-out name was parked away from the others, at the far end of the hardstand, guarded by military police. No one was allowed near it, except a small group of mechanics and one intelligence officer who never removed his gloves. The crew arrived before dawn. No laughter, no casual talk. They climbed into the aircraft like men walking into a confession booth. And before the engines even started, the radio operator transmitted a coded message to someone on the ground. Not the tower, not the squadron. Someone else. Then the B-17 rolled out and joined the formation like nothing was unusual. But the Germans had changed too. Heinemann's warning had spread through Luftwaffe channels like wildfire. Pilots began whispering about an American trap bomber. Some called it a devil machine. Some called it a butcher. But the most frightening thing was that the rumors matched. Different units, different sectors, different days. Yet the descriptions were the same. A B-17 that acted crippled, fell behind, and turned the rear approach into a death sentence. So Germany did what Germany always did when a problem wouldn't die. They escalated. The target that day was a rail yard, an artery of steel feeding troops and fuel toward the front. The Americans wanted it burned. The Germans wanted the bombers dead. Flak batteries were positioned like teeth along the route, and fighter groups were held back, waiting for the perfect moment. The bomber stream entered the danger zone. Black bursts of flak bloomed around them. The sky became a shaking cage. And almost immediately, the B-17 began to lag again. Not by accident. It drifted backward, lower, away from the protective box. Smoke appeared from its left engine, the same pattern as before. Too controlled, too familiar. The other bombers kept going, because no one in formation would slow down for a straggler. That was the rule. If you broke formation to help, you died too. So the B-17 was alone. And that's when the Germans struck. Not with a handful of fighters. With everything. A full swarm. Dozens. Coming in from multiple directions. Not a normal intercept. This was an execution order. Heinemann was among them. And he had been told one thing. Do not get behind it. Destroy it from a distance. From the sides. From the front. If possible, force it down with flak, but do not chase it like a wounded animal. Because it wasn't wounded. It was bait. The first wave came in head-on. Heinemann watched 3 fighters dive straight into the B-17's nose, cannons firing. The bomber's nose guns responded, and 1 fighter took hits and rolled away smoking. Another pulled up too late and clipped the bomber's wing, spiraling out of control. The third, bold, reckless, held his line, firing into the cockpit. For a moment, it looked like the bomber might finally die. Glass shattered. The nose section sparked. The B-17 shuddered hard. Then something happened that made Heinemann's spine go cold. The bomber's top turret rotated, not upward, not sideways. Backward. And it fired into the head-on attacker as he passed, catching him in the back like a hunter shooting prey that had already run by. The fighter burst into flames instantly. Heinemann clenched his jaw. Even the turret usage was wrong. Everything about this bomber was designed for one thing: punishing anyone who got close. The second wave attacked from the sides. They aimed for the wings, the engines, the fuel tanks. They fired and peeled away. The B-17 took hits. It began to bleed smoke and vapor trails. It looked like it was finally collapsing. And then the bomber did something that no B-17 pilot would ever do if he was trying to survive. It slowed down even more. It practically stopped in the sky compared to the others. It let itself become a hanging target. And the Germans couldn't resist, because in war, when you smell blood, you rush in. The third wave went for the kill. They attacked from behind, and that was the moment the secret weapon finally revealed itself. A panel under the bomber's belly opened. Not the ball turret. A second opening, longer, lower, shaped like a hidden mouth. And from it, a gun swung out. Not a machine gun, not a standard turret. A cannon. Heinemann didn't recognize it at first because it didn't belong on an American bomber. It looked heavier, darker, brutal, like it had been ripped off a different aircraft and welded into place. It fired once. The sound wasn't heard in the cockpit, but the effect was immediate. A German fighter behind the B-17 simply vanished in a flash of metal and smoke. The plane didn't catch fire. It didn't spiral. It ceased to exist as a whole object. The wing tore away. The fuselage split. Pieces flew outward like shrapnel. Heinemann's heart slammed. That was not .50 caliber fire. That was a high-explosive cannon round. And then the cannon fired again. Another fighter exploded. And again. A third fighter broke apart. Debris smashing into a fourth. The Luftwaffe pilots panicked because they finally understood what they were facing. This wasn't a bomber with extra guns. This was a bomber with a hidden anti-fighter cannon firing backward. A weapon built for ambush. A flying trap. Heinemann pulled up hard, almost blacking out. His radio erupted with screaming. "Break off! Break off!" God, what is that thing? He's firing a cannon. He's firing a cannon from the belly. The Germans scattered, but the B-17 didn't chase them. It waited, like a spider in a web, and when a fighter hesitated, when one pilot tried to take a longer shot from behind, the cannon fired again and erased him. The Americans had created a rear kill zone so deadly that the Luftwaffe couldn't approach without dying. But the true horror wasn't the cannon. It was how the crew used it. Because they weren't firing wildly. They were selecting targets. The gunner, whoever operated that weapon, fired only when the fighter was perfectly positioned. Perfect distance. Perfect angle. One shot. One kill. It was execution-level precision. Heinemann had seen veteran flak gunners. He had seen ace fighter pilots, but he had never seen a bomber crew operate like this. This wasn't defense. This was deliberate slaughter. The engagement spiraled into chaos. American escorts finally noticed what was happening and rushed in, but by then the trap had already done its work. German fighters were falling in clusters. Some were shot by Mustangs, some by the B-17's standard guns, but a shocking number, too many, were being destroyed behind the fortress where no escort fighter could have been firing. And the Luftwaffe pilots knew it. They were dying to something they couldn't counter. Heinemann watched as 3 fighters tried to coordinate a simultaneous attack from behind and below, hoping to overwhelm the gunner. The first 2 were shredded by the waist guns and tail gun. The third survived long enough to pull up. And the cannon fired. The third fighter exploded so violently that the shockwave buffeted Heinemann's own aircraft even at distance. Heinemann swore. 17. The number suddenly felt possible, not as propaganda, As math, because every time a fighter entered that rear funnel, it died. And every time a fighter died, the others became more desperate, more likely to make mistakes. And mistakes fed the trap. Then came the German countermeasure, flak. If they couldn't approach it, they would drown it in steel. A heavy battery opened up directly under the B-17. Black bursts surrounded it, so close the bomber disappeared in smoke. Heinemann watched carefully, hoping, praying that the flak would finally tear it apart. For several seconds, the B-17 was gone. Then it emerged, still flying, but not intact. The left wing was shredded. The plane was losing altitude fast. Smoke poured from 2 engines now. The tail section looked twisted. It was dying. Heinemann felt a grim relief. Finally. The monster was mortal. The Germans surged again, ready to finish it. And that's when the B-17 did the last thing anyone expected. It turned, not toward safety, not toward England. It turned toward the German fighters. It turned into them. A B-17 turning aggressively wasn't normal. It was a heavy bomber, slow to maneuver. But this aircraft rolled just enough to expose its belly and rear arc, positioning itself so the cannon and the rear guns had maximum coverage. It was presenting its weapon like a knife, and the Luftwaffe pilots, trapped between flak and the bomber's kill zone, hesitated again. Heinemann saw the faces of his comrades in his mind, men he had flown with for years, men who would be dead in seconds if they made the wrong choice. Heinemann did something that would later ruin his career. He retreated. He turned away and climbed, ignoring the screams on the radio, ignoring the officer's orders. He left the fight because he finally understood the truth. The Americans were willing to sacrifice one bomber crew if it meant wiping out entire fighter groups, and the Germans were walking into it. The final tally of that day was never written cleanly in one place. That's how secrets survive in war. But the witness statements were consistent. German pilots reported a single B-17 destroying fighters with an explosive weapon from the rear. American escort pilots reported seeing German aircraft break apart behind the straggler. A British radar station operator recorded a sudden, abnormal loss of multiple German fighter signals in the same airspace. And on the ground in England, when the bomber returned, it didn't taxi to the normal line. It was directed to a separate strip. Ambulances were waiting. Military police formed a perimeter. The engines shut down, and only 3 crew members climbed out. 3 out of 10. They stumbled onto the tarmac like ghosts. One of them, covered in blood that wasn't all his, looked at the intelligence officer waiting nearby and said something that never appeared in official reports. They know now. The officer didn't ask what he meant. He only asked, "Did you use it?" The surviving crewman nodded, and the officer's face tightened, like a man hearing a death sentence. Because the Germans didn't just lose fighters that day. They learned the truth. They learned the Americans had built a trap bomber. And now Germany would do what it always did. When it discovered a weapon it couldn't beat, it would try to steal it. Or destroy it. And if it couldn't destroy it in the air, it would destroy it on the ground. That night, in a German intelligence office, a report was typed and stamped with a classification so high that most officers would never see it. The report described the bomber, the modifications, the cannon, and the exact airfield in England where it was believed to operate. Then the report ended with a single line. Operation, night erasure, priority, absolute. The first time the Germans tried to kill the bomber on the ground, it almost worked. Not with a bombing raid, not with fighters, not with flak. With silence. Because by 1944, Germany understood something terrifying. If that B-17 stayed in the air, it would keep doing what it was designed to do, drag Luftwaffe pilots into a slaughter funnel and erase them. And Germany could not afford that anymore. They were running out of experienced men, running out of fuel, running out of time. A weapon like that wasn't just killing aircraft, it was killing the Luftwaffe's future. So the order came down through channels that never touched normal command. A black-stamped directive, no names, no signatures, only one instruction, erase it. The airfield in England was identified. The bomber's maintenance schedule was guessed. The crew rotation was mapped. And then, a special unit was selected. Men trained not for battle, but for infiltration. Men who could slip into enemy territory, kill without noise and leave nothing behind. In German paperwork, the mission had a polite title. In the minds of the men assigned, it was something else. A suicide. The English airfield was quiet that night. Wind across the hardstand. Dim lights. Shadows of bombers parked like sleeping beasts. Most of the base was exhausted. Crews were sleeping in barracks. Mechanics had finally stopped hammering metal and crawling inside wings. The B-17 with the blacked-out name sat alone at the far end. guarded by 2 MPs and a chain barrier. A canvas cover hid part of its nose, like someone trying to keep it from being photographed. The aircraft looked damaged, patched, ugly, nothing special to the casual eye. But the Germans didn't need to see it. They already knew what it was. A small boat crossed the channel earlier that evening, riding low, engines muffled. The men aboard were dressed in dark gear, faces smeared, equipment wrapped to prevent metal clinks. They were not ordinary soldiers. Their rifles were suppressed. Their knives were sharpened for close work. Their explosives were shaped and measured. They landed far from the airfield, moved inland through hedgerows, and reached the perimeter just after midnight. The fence was cut. The guards were avoided. And the base, one of the most protected places in England, was breached without a single alarm. Because the Germans weren't attacking like an army. They were attacking like ghosts. At 1:17 a.m., one of the MPs guarding the isolated B-17 felt something brush the back of his neck. He turned, expecting to see his partner. He saw nothing. Then he felt a hand clamp over his mouth. A blade slid between his ribs so cleanly that he didn't even scream. His body was lowered to the ground quietly. The second MP never noticed, because at the same moment, another German commando stepped behind him and snapped his neck with a single movement. 2 guards. Gone. No gunshots. No shouting. The commandos moved like they had rehearsed the airfield in their dreams. They reached the bomber. One of them placed his palm against the fuselage, feeling the cold metal, almost like he was touching something alive. Another crawled under the belly, shining a tiny filtered flashlight upward. And then he froze. Because the rumor was true, there was a second turret opening. There was an extra panel. There were welded brackets that didn't belong on an American aircraft. The commando whispered in German, low and tense, "Verdammt, it's real." They didn't waste time. They placed explosives in 3 locations, near the wing root, near the fuel lines, and under the belly where the hidden weapon sat. They were going to do more than destroy the plane. They were going to destroy the evidence. They were going to make sure no one could ever rebuild it. The timers were set. The men began to withdraw, and then, behind them, a voice spoke in English. "Calm. Too calm. You boys lost?" The commandos spun. At the edge of the floodlight's reach stood a man in an American flight jacket. No helmet. No weapon visible. Hands in his pockets like he was standing outside a bar. His face was half-shadowed, but his eyes were clear. One of the commandos raised his rifle. The American didn't flinch. He just smiled slightly. And then, from the darkness behind the bomber, another American stepped forward. Then another. 3 men. All wearing flight gear. All looking like they had been waiting. The German leader's instincts screamed. This wasn't chance. This wasn't bad timing. This was a trap. The German leader barked in German, "Shoot them!" The rifles snapped up, and then the airfield exploded with light. Floodlights switched on all at once, blinding the commandos. The Germans turned, disoriented, and saw MPs rushing in from both sides, rifles aimed. A siren screamed to life. The German leader realized the horrifying truth. The Americans had known. They had been waiting for this raid, and now the commandos were surrounded. But the German leader didn't panic. He did something worse. He smiled, because he knew something the Americans didn't. The explosives were already ticking. Gunfire erupted. Not a long battle. Short, brutal, close. One commando dropped 2 MPs before being shot. Another tried to sprint for the fence and was cut down. The German leader fought like a cornered animal, firing, moving, trying to reach the bomber again. The Americans shouted, "Get away from the aircraft! Clear the hardstand!" But the German leader screamed back in English, broken but understandable. "Too late!" He pointed at the B-17. And then the timers hit 0. The explosion didn't just destroy the bomber. It tore open the night. The wing root blew first, sending a shockwave across the hardstand. Fuel ignited, turning the aircraft into a sudden inferno. The belly panel ruptured with a violent burst, throwing twisted metal into the air like knives. The blast flung bodies, equipment, debris. The fireball lit up the entire base like daylight. Men screamed. Alarms howled. Engines of nearby aircraft caught fire. For several seconds, the airfield looked like it was being bombed. And when the flames settled, the B-17 was no longer a bomber. It was a skeleton. Burned ribs of metal. Black smoke. A crater under the belly. The secret weapon, whatever it had been, was gone. And the Americans stared at the wreckage in horror, not because they lost a plane, because Germany had just proven something far more dangerous. They were willing to send men into England itself to erase this weapon. The next morning, the base was locked down. No one left, no one entered. Military police questioned everyone. Mechanics were separated. Officers were furious. But the strangest thing was what happened in the intelligence tent. An American officer stood over the wreckage photos, jaw clenched, and said, "We can't let them think they won." Another officer asked, confused, "They destroyed it. It's gone." The first officer replied quietly, "They destroyed one airframe, not the program." The word program hung in the air like poison, because it meant the B-17 had never been a single miracle plane. It meant there were others. Or there could be. And it meant the Germans had just crossed a line that would trigger an American response. A response designed to do one thing: make the Luftwaffe bleed so badly it would never recover. That same day, deep inside German command, Heinemann was called in. He walked into an office he had never been allowed inside before. A man in civilian clothing sat behind the desk, no insignia, no rank displayed. The room smelled like paper and cigarettes. The civilian slid a report across the table. A successful sabotage operation in England. The bomber destroyed. Evidence erased. Heinemann should have felt relief. Instead, he felt dread, because he knew what happens when you wound an enemy's secret weapon program. They don't stop. They improve. The civilian asked Heinemann a single question: "If the Americans build another one, how do we stop it?" Heinemann answered honestly, "You don't. You kill it before it leaves the ground." The civilian stared at him, then said, "Good. That is what we will do." Within a week, German reconnaissance began watching American airfields in England like predators. Spies, cameras, reports, and the Luftwaffe began preparing something it had never done before at this scale. A concentrated, targeted airfield strike. Not to bomb runways, not to hit fuel depots, but to kill one thing only: the next trap bomber. And if possible, the men who built it, the men who flew it. The men who knew the secret, because Germany had learned the most dangerous truth of all: the Americans weren't just dropping bombs. They were engineering fear. The Americans didn't mourn the destroyed bomber for long. They couldn't. In wartime, grief is a luxury. The dead are counted, the wreckage is cleared, and the machine keeps moving. But this time, something unusual happened after the sabotage. The airfield didn't just repair damage. It went quiet in a way that felt unnatural. No one joked. No one argued. The mechanics worked without speaking. The officers stopped using names in public. Orders were delivered by men who didn't belong to the base. And at night, military police patrolled the hangars with dogs, flashlights, and loaded rifles. Because the sabotage had proven something terrifying, Germany now knew the trap was real, and Germany would come again. So the Americans did what they always did when cornered. They built something worse. Not a new plane. A new idea. A weaponized myth. A week later, in a hangar sealed off with canvas and guards, another B-17 sat under work lights. It wasn't fresh from the factory. It was older, patched, scarred, chosen deliberately because it looked believable as a wounded straggler. Its nose art was plain. Its tail number was unremarkable. It was the kind of bomber no one would remember. Except it wasn't normal. Its belly had been rebuilt with reinforced plating. Its waist gun positions had been widened and strengthened. The tail section had extra armor. The interior had been stripped and reconfigured. Where a normal B-17 carried bomb load, this one carried something else: ammunition, spare barrels, and a hidden mount welded into the frame like a parasite. The secret weapon was back, but it wasn't identical. This time, it was cleaner, more stable, more deadly. And the men who worked on it didn't talk about it like engineers. They talked about it like executioners. Because now it wasn't about survival. It was about numbers. The new crew was not the old crew. Not fully. That was part of the darkness. 3 survivors from the sabotage explosion, men who had crawled out of fire and watched their aircraft burn, were quietly assigned to the new bomber. They were not asked if they wanted to fly again. They were told, and they accepted with faces that looked carved out of stone. A new pilot was added. A man with too many missions, too many dead friends, too much quiet rage. A new gunner was added too, someone not from a bomber group, someone with a different kind of training. He didn't drink with the others. He didn't socialize. He stayed near the aircraft, checking the hidden weapons mount like a man checking a coffin lock. No one called him by name. They called him the specialist. And when the ground crew asked what his job was, an officer answered with a flat voice: to make sure the Germans pay. Germany, meanwhile, prepared its strike. Reconnaissance had spotted increased security and unusual hangar activity at the airfield. German intelligence concluded the Americans were rebuilding the trap bomber. And the order came down: destroy it before it flies. The Luftwaffe assembled a force meant not for interception, but for a surgical airfield attack. Fighter bombers loaded with rockets, fast aircraft carrying bombs, escorts prepared to protect them. The mission was risky: crossing the channel low, evading radar, hitting the base at dawn. The German pilots were told something that made their blood run cold. This is not a normal raid. This is a decapitation. They were going to kill a weapon, and if possible, the men who knew how to use it. At dawn, the German strike force crossed the water like a swarm of insects. They flew low, skimming waves, hiding under the radar net. They rose only when the English coastline appeared. Then they climbed, engines screaming, and headed for the airfield. The base alarms went off too late. The first rockets hit the runway. The second wave hit the fuel dump. The third wave hit the hangar, and inside that hangar the Americans were waiting. The hangar doors were already open. The B-17 rolled out. Not in panic, not in confusion, in perfect timing. As bombs fell and rockets slammed into the tarmac, the bomber taxied forward through smoke, engines roaring. The German pilots in the attack wave saw it and felt a sudden shock of disbelief. The trap bomber was leaving. It was escaping. They dove to destroy it on the ground. And that was exactly what the Americans wanted, because the Germans had just delivered themselves into the one place the bomber was designed to kill from: behind, low, close. The B-17 lifted off into a sky filled with fire. Flak from the base defenses cracked upward. German fighters swerved and fired. The bomber climbed sluggishly, heavy, wounded-looking, like it was barely airborne. One engine sputtered. Smoke appeared. The aircraft drifted away from the airfield, alone, separated from friendly cover. It looked like the perfect kill. German fighters chased it instantly. They weren't thinking strategically anymore. They were thinking emotionally. They wanted to end the nightmare. They wanted revenge for the pilots the bomber had erased. They wanted to prove the Luftwaffe was still strong. They closed in behind it like wolves. And then the rear of the bomber opened up. The belly panel shifted. The hidden mount locked into position, and the secret weapon fired. The first shot blew a German fighter apart so violently that the debris struck the second aircraft behind it. The second fighter rolled and slammed into the ground. The third pulled up and was shredded by tailgun fire. The fourth tried to swing wide, but the waist guns caught him in a crossfire. The fifth launched rockets at the bomber and missed, the rockets streaking into empty air. The Germans panicked. They weren't fighting a bomber. They were fighting a flying kill zone. And the worst part was the setting. This was happening over England, over an American airfield, where the Germans had expected to be hunters. Now they were prey. The B-17 turned slightly, just enough to keep its rear arc aligned with the pursuing fighters. It wasn't trying to escape. It was shaping the fight, drawing them into a funnel. One by one, German aircraft fell. Some exploded. Some broke apart. Some caught fire and spiraled down into fields. The sky over the airfield became a graveyard. And on the ground, American mechanics and MPs watched in stunned silence as German planes crashed into English soil. By the time the German strike force realized what was happening, it was too late. They tried to break off, but breaking off meant exposing their sides to the escort fighters that had finally arrived, Mustangs screaming into the fight. The Germans were trapped between the B-17's rear kill zone and the American fighters above. It became a slaughter, and that day, something happened that would later be written into official records with careful wording and hidden footnotes. 17 German aircraft were destroyed, not by a squadron, not by a wing. In the same engagement, around the same time, tied to the same aircraft. The paperwork would later spread the kills across multiple sources. That's how militaries hide uncomfortable truths. But pilots on both sides knew what had happened. They had watched the trap bomber do what it was built to do, and they had watched Germany walk into it again. When the B-17 finally landed back at the base, after the raid, after the dogfight, it rolled to a stop with its engines coughing smoke. Ground crews rushed in. MPs formed a perimeter. Ambulances waited again. The crew climbed out. All of them this time, but they looked worse than before. Their faces were pale. Their hands shook. Their eyes were too still. The specialist climbed down last. He didn't look at the cheering men around him. He walked straight to the intelligence officer and said quietly, "They came for it." "Like we knew they would." The officer nodded once, then asked the question that mattered. "How many?" The specialist answered without emotion, 17. The officer didn't smile. He didn't celebrate. He simply wrote the number down, because now the myth was no longer a rumor. It was a fact, and Germany would not let that fact live. That night, German command received the report. The airfield strike had failed. The trap bomber had flown, and 17 aircraft were gone. The reaction inside the German high command was not anger. It was fear. A kind of fear that doesn't come from losing planes but from realizing the enemy has created something you cannot counter with skill or bravery. Because bravery doesn't matter when the rules of engagement have been rewritten, and Germany knew the Americans would do it again. So the order came down. No more chasing stragglers. No more rear attacks. No more pride. If the trap bomber appears, you do one thing only. You destroy it with mass fire. And if you cannot destroy it, you withdraw. But that order created its own nightmare. Because a Luftwaffe that withdraws is a Luftwaffe that loses the sky. And losing the sky meant losing the war. After the day the number 17 entered the records, the war in the air changed. Not officially, not in speeches, not in newspapers, but in the minds of the men who fought above Europe, something snapped. The Germans stopped seeing the American bomber stream as just a target. They began seeing it as a machine designed to grind pilots into nothing. And the trap bomber, this one B-17 that seemed to carry death in its belly, became a symbol of that machine. German fighter groups started refusing rear attacks on stragglers. Pilots who would have once dived in for the kill now pulled away, choosing to live rather than prove bravery. And the Luftwaffe commanders hated that. They needed aggression. They needed young men to charge into gunfire. But you can't command a man to step into a meat grinder once he's seen it. So Germany did what it always did when fear spread. They tried to remove the source. Not by shooting it down in a dogfight, by making the sky itself a trap. The new German plan wasn't about fighters. It was about flak. A corridor of heavy anti-aircraft fire was built along the expected route to the next American target. Not scattered batteries, concentrated, overlapping, timed, calculated. They weren't trying to hit random bombers. They were trying to cripple one specific aircraft in a specific way. They wanted the trap bomber to fall behind. Because that's when it killed. And Germany's plan was to force it to fall behind into a zone where something else would be waiting. A special squadron. A capture team. Because the German high command had finally realized something terrifying. If the Americans could build a trap bomber once, they could build 10. And if Germany could capture the secret weapon inside it, they could copy it, or at least learn how to counter it. So the order came down. Do not destroy the bomber immediately. Disable it. Force it down. Take it intact. That order was insane. But war, by 1944, was already insane. The next mission was a deep strike. Industrial targets, heavy defenses, the kind of run where bombers came back in pieces. The trap bomber was inserted into the formation quietly. It didn't fly at the edge. It didn't stand out. It looked like just another fortress. But the Germans were watching. The moment the bomber stream crossed into the flat corridor, the sky erupted. Black bursts surrounded the formation like a storm of fists. Bombers shuddered. Wings flexed. Engines coughed. Men screamed into oxygen masks. The bomber stream tightened, trying to stay together. Then a burst detonated close under the trap bomber. The explosion hit its underside hard. The aircraft jerked violently. Smoke poured from the belly. The bomber began to drop, and for the first time, it looked real. Not controlled smoke. Not stage damage. Real damage. The trap bomber was losing altitude fast. Inside the cockpit, alarms screamed. The pilot fought the controls. The plane fell behind. And the Germans smiled, because now it was happening exactly as planned. As the bomber drifted away from the formation, the escorts stayed with the main stream. They couldn't break off. Not deep in Germany. Not with fighters swarming. That was the cruel math of air war. So the trap bomber was alone again. But this time, the Germans didn't rush in like wolves. They waited. A group of fighters appeared at distance, circling like cautious predators. Heinemann was among them, watching with a hard face. He had been ordered to lead the engagement because he was one of the few who had survived encounters with the trap bomber. His instructions were simple. Cripple it. Force it down. Do not die. Heinemann approached carefully, staying out of the rear arc. The other fighters did the same. They fired from the sides, aiming for engines and control surfaces. The B-17's guns responded, but the Germans kept distance. The trap bomber's hidden weapon didn't fire. Not yet. The Germans weren't giving it a shot. The bomber lost another engine. Then another. Its altitude dropped. And now it was obvious. This wasn't bait anymore. This was a plane, dying in real time. Heinemann's mouth went dry. Because that meant one thing. The Americans had finally lost control of their own monster. The B-17 began a slow descent toward open countryside. The pilot was trying to keep it level long enough to reach friendly territory, or at least avoid crashing. But they were too deep in Germany. The nearest safe ground was a dream. German fighters continued to harass it, not killing it, just shepherding it downward like wolves guiding a wounded animal toward a cliff. And below, hidden in a field near a small forest, trucks were waiting. Men in black uniforms. SS, not Luftwaffe. A capture team. They had anti-aircraft machine guns positioned. They had vehicles ready. They had orders that made their blood hot. Take the bomber. Take the weapon. Take any surviving crew. Because the crew would know how it worked, and Germany wanted that knowledge. More than it wanted the bomber's medal. Inside the B-17, the crew was bleeding. The waist gunner was wounded. The radio operator was shaking. The pilot's hands were slick with sweat. The specialist, silent, pale, was strapped in near the hidden weapon system, checking it with a kind of cold obsession. He knew something the others didn't. If the bomber landed intact, they would not be taken prisoner like normal airmen. They would be tortured, because Germany didn't want them alive. Germany wanted the secret. The pilot shouted over the noise, "We're going down! Prepare to bail!" But the specialist didn't move. He stared at the hidden weapons mount. Then he said something quiet that cut through the chaos like a knife. "No." The pilot turned, furious. "What do you mean, no?" The specialist looked up, eyes dead calm. "If we bail, they take the plane." The pilot's face twisted. "We don't have a choice," the specialist answered, voice flat. "Yes, we do." And then he reached for something under his seat. A switch. A lever. A final option. The B-17 dropped below the cloud layer. The ground rushed up. German fighters circled above like vultures. The countryside below looked peaceful. Fields, trees, a road. But in one field, hidden by camouflage netting, the capture team waited. They saw the bomber descending and began moving. Trucks rolled forward. Men raised rifles. Machine gun nests pivoted. They were ready to swarm the aircraft the moment it touched down. And the B-17 was about to touch down. Its wheels dropped. The pilot lined up for a belly landing in a field. The crew braced. The bomber's shadow swept across the grass. And then the specialist pulled the lever. For half a second, nothing happened. Then the inside of the B-17 changed. A deep mechanical clunk echoed through the fuselage. Panels shifted. The hidden weapon mount locked into a new position. Not aimed backward. Not aimed at fighters. Aimed downward. Toward the ground. The pilot shouted, "What the hell are you doing?" The specialist didn't answer. He pressed another switch. And a low hum began, not like an engine, like something charging. The radio operator screamed, "That's not a gun." The specialist finally spoke, his voice almost gentle. "It's not just a gun." The pilot's eyes widened, because he realized what the Americans had truly built. The trap bomber wasn't just designed to kill fighters. It was designed to deny capture, to erase itself, to burn its secret into the earth. The B-17 hit the field hard. Metal screamed. The fuselage skidded across grass. The wings flexed. The bomber slid toward the waiting German capture team. The Germans ran forward, shouting, excited, hungry. They thought they were about to seize the most valuable weapon in the sky. Then the specialist pressed the final switch, and the belly of the B-17 opened like a mouth. The explosion was not like a bomb. It was sharper, more focused. A directed blast. A weaponized discharge. The ground under the bomber erupted. A cone of fire and shrapnel tore upward and outward, ripping through the capture team like a scythe. Trucks flipped. Men vanished. Bodies were thrown like dolls. The field became a crater of burning earth. The shockwave slammed the bomber itself. The fuselage cracked. Fire rushed inside. The crew screamed. The pilot tried to crawl. The waist gunner burned. The radio operator's oxygen line ignited. And in the middle of it, the specialist sat strapped in, face calm, eyes fixed forward like a man watching a door close. Because he had made the choice. If they couldn't bring the plane home, no one would have it. Not Germany. Not even history. Above, Heinemann watched the field erupt. He saw the trucks flip. He saw men die. He saw the bomber tear itself apart from the inside. And his stomach turned, because in that moment he understood the true horror. The Americans had built a weapon so secret, so lethal, that they had designed it with a self-destruction system powerful enough to wipe out an entire capture squad. And they had assigned men willing to die to trigger it. Heinemann whispered into his radio, voice shaking. "It destroyed itself." One of the German pilots replied, stunned. "Did we win?" Heinemann didn't answer. Because he knew they hadn't won. They had just watched a new kind of warfare, not about victory. About denial. About erasing evidence. About making sure the enemy could never learn. And Heinemann realized something worse. If the Americans were willing to do this with one bomber, what else were they building? The field burned for hours. German soldiers arrived late, finding only twisted wreckage, charred bodies, and fragments of metal embedded in the earth. The capture team was gone. The bomber was gone. The secret weapon was gone. But one thing remained. A single piece of the belly mount, half melted, stamped with a number. A serial marking. German intelligence recovered it and carried it away like a holy relic. Because it was proof. The weapon existed, and even destroyed, it could still be studied. And that meant Germany had not given up. They had only changed the hunt. The Germans didn't recover the bomber, but they recovered something worse. A melted chunk of metal, warped by heat, blackened by fire, still carrying a stamped serial marking. It was small enough to fit in a man's hand. It should have been meaningless scrap. But in wartime intelligence, a single stamped number can be more valuable than 100 dead bodies. Because numbers lead to factories. Factories lead to programs. Programs lead to people. And people can be killed. German intelligence carried the fragment into a secure office and photographed it under harsh light. The marking wasn't American standard. It didn't match a normal B-17 component code. It looked like a hybrid, part Luftwaffe, part something else, which meant the Americans hadn't just modified a bomber. They had used German technology. They had stolen it, or captured it, and then turned it back on them. That was the kind of insult that didn't fade. It demanded revenge. So Germany did what it always did when firepower failed. They used a knife. A message was sent through channels that never touched the front lines. A request for names. For shipping records. For aircraft parts moving through England. For unusual deliveries. For new security patterns at American airfields. And somewhere in London, a man read that request and smiled. He was not a soldier. He was not a pilot. He was a clerk. A quiet British civilian, working near the docks, moving paperwork for cargo shipments. No one noticed him. No one feared him. He drank tea, wore plain coats, and spoke politely. But he was German intelligence. And he had been waiting for a request like this for years. Because war isn't won only in the sky. It's won in the shadows. The clerk began feeding information out in small pieces. Shipping crates marked as machine components. Special deliveries under armed guard. A hangar in England that had suddenly doubled its security. And then he found the detail that made his breath catch. A shipment from a captured German airfield, sent quietly to England months earlier. The manifest listed it as salvage. But the clerk knew what it really meant. The Americans had recovered something from Germany. Something heavy. Something meant for aircraft. Something that would never appear in public documents. And the clerk sent one final message back to Berlin. There is another one. A new airframe is being prepared. In England, the Americans were doing exactly that. After the self-destruction in the field, the program didn't stop. It couldn't. Not after 17. Not after Germany's panic. Not after the Luftwaffe began pulling back from stragglers. The American commanders saw the effect and wanted more. But they had a new problem. The Germans were no longer attacking like fools. They were learning. They were adapting. They were sending sabotage teams. They were trying to capture. They were watching airfields. So the Americans built the next trap bomber with a new philosophy: make it look normal. Make it act normal, and kill them when they least expect it. The third trap bomber was built inside a hangar so restricted that even most officers weren't allowed inside. Its modifications were hidden under standard panels. Its belly weapon mount was disguised. Its extra guns were concealed behind removable plating. It looked like a regular B-17. And that was the point, because the Germans were hunting a monster. The Americans were about to give them a ghost. Heinemann was still alive, which meant he was still useful. German command pulled him from normal operations and assigned him to a special task force, a multi-squadron intercept group designed for one mission only. Kill the trap bomber. Not capture it, not study it. Kill it, and if possible, kill the men who flew it. Because German intelligence now understood something that made them sick. Even if they destroyed the plane, the Americans could rebuild it. But if they killed the crew, especially the specialist, the knowledge might die with them. So Heinemann was given a file. Inside were blurry photos of wreckage, witness statements, and one final page with a typed line. The specialist is the key. Heinemann stared at that line for a long time. Then he closed the file, And he made a personal vow. If he ever saw that bomber again, he would not retreat. Even if it killed him. The mission that brought them together again was a deep penetration strike into Germany's industrial heart. The bomber stream was huge. Escorts were heavy. The sky was crowded. And somewhere inside that formation, the new trap bomber flew quietly. No smoke. No obvious damage. No falling behind. For the first hour, nothing happened. German fighters attacked the edges as usual. Bombers fell. Escorts fought. Flak bursts shook the formation. Men died. But the trap bomber stayed steady. It was almost disappointing. German pilots began to think the rumor was gone. Maybe the Americans had stopped. Maybe the program had died in that field explosion. Then the bomber stream crossed a flak belt, so dense that even experienced crews went pale. And in that moment, the trap bomber did something subtle. It didn't fall behind. It didn't slow down. It simply drifted sideways, out of the tight box, into a slightly lower altitude band. Not enough to look like a straggler. Just enough to be slightly isolated. And the Germans noticed. Heinemann's group was waiting above the bomber stream, holding altitude like hawks. When the order came, they dove. Not behind, not below. From the side, a coordinated, multi-angle attack meant to overwhelm the bomber's guns. Heinemann picked his approach carefully. He aimed for the wing route. If he could rip the wing, the bomber would die no matter what weapons it carried. The first wave fired. The B-17 took hits. The second wave fired. The B-17 shook. The third wave came in. And still, the bomber didn't reveal its secret. No cannon fire. No abnormal rear kill zone. Nothing. Heinemann felt a surge of hope. Maybe the Americans had lost the weapon. Maybe the rumors were exaggerated. Then the trap bomber did something that made Heinemann's blood freeze. It opened its bomb bay doors. In the middle of a fighter attack. At altitude. Over Germany. Bomb bay doors opening mid-combat was insane. It increased drag, slowed the aircraft, made it more vulnerable. It was like a man opening his chest during a knife fight. Heinemann thought, they're bailing. They're done. But then he saw what dropped out. Not bombs. Not men. Small objects. Multiple. They fell behind the bomber like seeds. And as they fell, they began to spin. The objects exploded into bright white flares. Not for illumination. For blindness. The German fighters behind the bomber suddenly flew into a wall of burning light. Their cockpits filled with glare. Their eyes watered. Their instruments became hard to read. And then, in that blinded moment, the trap bomber slowed. Just a little. Just enough. And the Germans, disoriented, angry, half-blind, did what they had sworn not to do. They drifted behind it. They chased. They closed distance. Because in combat, you don't think in rules. You think in rage. And the moment they entered the rear arc, the belly panel opened, the secret weapon fired. Not once. A burst. A brutal sequence. And the effect was beyond anything Heinemann had seen. The fighters behind the bomber didn't just explode. They were torn apart by a chain of high-explosive impacts. One fighter vanished. Another disintegrated. Another caught fire and slammed into the next. The sky behind the bomber became a spinning storm of debris. Heinemann watched 3 aircraft die in less than 2 seconds. And the most horrifying part was the sound on the radio. Screams. Not long. Not dramatic. Short, cut-off screams as pilots realized too late they were already dead. Heinemann's throat tightened. The Americans had upgraded the trap. They had added flares. They had learned to force fighters into the kill zone even when the Germans tried to avoid it. This wasn't a bomber. It was a designed massacre. Heinemann fought his instinct to pull away. He kept his promise. He swung wide and came in from the side again, aiming for the cockpit. He fired, rounds striking the nose. The bomber's glass shattered. The aircraft lurched. Heinemann saw a face inside, an American pilot, blood on his cheek, still flying. Heinemann pressed in closer, ready to finish it. And then the bomber did something that made him realize the Americans had thought of everything. The top turret rotated toward him, not to fire. To distract. Because at the same time, the bomber's side gun, one of the hidden waist mounts, opened up at an angle Heinemann didn't expect. Tracers ripped across his wing. His aircraft shuddered. Warning lights flared. His engine coughed. Heinemann's fighter began to lose power. He broke away, furious. He was hit. He was wounded. And he was still alive, which meant the trap bomber had chosen not to kill him. or it had missed. Either possibility made him sick. The battle continued for minutes that felt like hours. German fighters attacked in waves. American escorts fought them off. Bombers continued toward the target. Flak burst. Smoke trails crisscrossed the sky like scars. And in the middle of it all, the trap bomber kept doing its job. Drawing in fighters. Erasing them. Again and again. Not always with the cannon. Sometimes with crossfire. Sometimes with escort fighters finishing the wounded. But always with the same pattern. The bomber created the kill zone. The Germans died inside it. By the time the Germans finally withdrew, the air around the trap bomber looked like a cemetery. And the Luftwaffe pilots knew something that felt like defeat. They could not stop it in the air. That night, in a German intelligence office, the clerk's information was reviewed again. Airfield security. Hangar location. Delivery routes. And then the German officer in charge made a decision, not a tactical decision. A moral one. He ordered the clerk to identify the exact personnel involved in the program, not just pilots. Mechanics. Officers. Anyone who touched the weapon. Because if Germany couldn't kill the bomber, they would kill the program. They would assassinate the men behind it. In England. In their beds. Meanwhile, in England, the trap bomber landed. It rolled to its isolated hardstand. MPs formed a perimeter. The crew climbed out, and for the first time, the specialist looked shaken. Not from fear. From something else. He stared at the aircraft's belly panel, still warm from firing. Then he looked at the intelligence officer and said quietly, "They're going to stop trying to shoot it down." The officer frowned. "What do you mean?" The specialist's eyes were dark. "They're going to come for us." That night, the airfield felt wrong. Not because of the wind, not because of the distant engine noise, but because the silence had weight. The trap bomber sat under a camouflage net like a sleeping animal, one that had already tasted blood. The MPs walked in circles. Rifles ready. Flashlights low. No jokes. No cigarettes. Even the officers stopped speaking in full sentences, because the specialist had said one thing that changed everything. "They're going to come for us." And for the first time, the Americans believed it. Not because they were scared of German pilots, but because they were scared of German intelligence. Because a fighter attack in the sky was honest. A man with a knife in the dark wasn't. Inside a small briefing room, the intelligence officer laid down photographs on a table. The specialist didn't sit. He stood like he was waiting to be arrested. The photos were from the wreckage field, where the second trap bomber had destroyed itself. Burnt metal. Shattered glass. A belly mount housing twisted like a broken jaw. And one close-up photo of the stamped serial marking. The officer spoke carefully. "We know they found it." The specialist's jaw tightened. The officer continued. "And we know they traced it." The specialist didn't blink. "Then it's over," he said quietly. The officer shook his head. "No. It's not over. We move you. We move the plane. We bury the program." The specialist leaned forward, voice low. "You can't bury this. Not after what it did." Outside, the trap bomber's crew were in their barracks. They were alive. But none of them looked like it. A rear gunner sat on his bunk staring at his hands, as if they weren't his anymore. A waist gunner cleaned his weapon again and again, even though it was already spotless. The pilot stared at the ceiling like he was watching enemy fighters that weren't there. And in the corner, the co-pilot whispered something that nobody answered. 17. Like it was a curse. The assassination order had already been sent. And it wasn't aimed at the bomber. It was aimed at the brain. Germany's intelligence network had one goal now. Kill the specialist. Not tomorrow. Not next week. Tonight, the clerk in London didn't carry a pistol. He didn't need one. He delivered something much more deadly than bullets. A name. A building. A location. And a small note. He is here. Airfield Sector B. The message was passed through a chain of hands that never met each other. It traveled like poison through pipes. And by midnight, it reached a German sabotage cell hiding in England. 3 men. Not soldiers. Not pilots. Just killers. They wore British coats. They carried British papers. They spoke enough English to buy a drink. And under their coats, they carried suppressed pistols and a small pack of explosives. Their mission wasn't complicated. Get in. Kill the specialist. Burn the bomber. Disappear. At 1:17 a.m., the perimeter fence was cut. Not loudly. Not dramatically. A quiet snip. Then another. A gap opened just wide enough for a man to slide through. The MPs didn't see it, because the saboteurs didn't approach where the guards were watching. They approached where guards assumed nobody would be stupid enough to try. That's how assassinations work. You don't fight strength. You attack arrogance. The saboteurs moved low through the grass. They could already see the hangar lights. They could smell fuel. They could hear distant footsteps. One of them whispered, "Quick." Quiet. In and out. They were almost close enough to touch the hangar wall when something happened. A light snapped on. A single beam swept across the grass. Then another. And another. The saboteurs froze, because the airfield had changed. The Americans weren't waiting to be attacked. They were waiting to catch the attack. A voice called out in the darkness, "Hands." The saboteurs didn't move. The voice came again, calm, American. "Hands, now." The saboteurs did what desperate men always do. They ran. And the airfield erupted. Gunfire cracked. Flares burst. MPs poured from the shadows like ghosts. One saboteur went down instantly, screaming as bullets tore through his coat. The second made it 10 steps before his legs folded and he slammed into the ground. The third reached for his pistol. And before he could raise it, a rifle butt smashed into his face. He hit the ground unconscious. In less than 30 seconds, the assassination was over. The specialist watched from the hangar door, face unreadable. The intelligence officer stepped beside him. "You were right," the officer said. The specialist didn't respond. He looked at the bodies. Then he looked at the bomber. And then he said something that sounded like a man speaking to himself. "They don't care about the plane anymore." The officer frowned. "What?" The specialist's eyes narrowed. "They're desperate. That means they're losing." The captured saboteur woke up in a small interrogation room. He was bleeding. His lip was split. His nose was broken. But he smiled, because he knew something the Americans didn't. The intelligence officer sat across from him. "Who sent you?" The saboteur laughed. "You think this is about a plane?" The officer's face hardened. "It's about murder." The saboteur leaned forward, eyes gleaming. "No, it's about humiliation." The officer stared. The saboteur whispered, "You made us afraid of your bomber. You made our pilots die like insects. You made our command look weak." The officer didn't speak. The saboteur continued, "So now, we will not kill the plane." He smiled wider. "We will kill the men who built it." The officer walked out of the room. He found the specialist and grabbed his arm. "We're moving you." The specialist didn't resist. He didn't argue. He just nodded once. Like he had expected this, the trap bomber was moved that same night. No paperwork, no announcement, no flight plan. It rolled out under darkness, escorted by armed vehicles, hidden under canvas and netting. And when it reached a different airfield, it was placed inside a hangar with no markings. Because now the war had changed again. The sky wasn't the only battlefield, but Germany didn't stop. They had lost their sabotage team. So they tried something else. Something colder. Something smarter. A Luftwaffe reconnaissance flight, high altitude, fast, slipped over England at dawn. It photographed the airfield from far away, and in the photos, Germany saw something terrifying. The bomber was gone, which meant the Americans had learned, which meant the weapon was still alive, which meant the nightmare would continue. Back in the air, the Germans made one last attempt. A final intercept, not for victory, for pride. A heavy attack was launched against a bomber formation returning from Germany. And once again, the trap bomber was there. Quiet, normal, hidden. The Germans saw it late. Too late. Heinemann was in the air again. His aircraft was patched from the previous battle. His hands were steady. His face was hollow. He didn't want to fight it. He wanted to kill it. Or die trying. Heinemann approached from above, refusing to enter the rear arc. He watched other fighters make the mistake. He watched them vanish. He watched the trap bomber's belly weapon flash. He watched the sky turn into broken metal and fire. And then Heinemann did something no sane pilot would do. He cut his engine. For a moment, his fighter went quiet. The wind screamed around his cockpit. He drifted, silent, into position without the usual engine roar giving him away. He lined up the bomber's cockpit. He didn't aim for wings. He didn't aim for engines. He aimed for the men. He fired. Rounds tore into the nose. Glass exploded. The bomber shuddered violently. For a second, Heinemann thought he had done it. Then the bomber's nose gun fired back. Heinemann's canopy shattered. A hot punch hit his shoulder. Blood sprayed. He fought the controls. His fighter spun. He tried to pull out, but the trap bomber's hidden waist gun opened up again. And this time, it didn't miss. Heinemann's aircraft erupted. A bloom of fire swallowed him whole. And the last thing he saw, through flame and smoke, was the B-17 still flying. Still alive. Still unstoppable. When the trap bomber landed again, the crew didn't cheer. They didn't celebrate. They didn't smile. They walked off the aircraft like men leaving a funeral. The specialist stepped down last. He looked at the bomber's belly. The weapon housing was scorched. Hot. Used. Then he turned to the intelligence officer. "It's done," he said. The officer blinked. "What do you mean?" The specialist exhaled. "They'll stop now." The officer didn't believe him. But the specialist continued. "They tried fighters. They tried sabotage. They tried assassination. They tried everything." He paused. "They can't stop it, so they'll pretend it never happened." Days later, a message came from higher command, not written in emotional language. Not dramatic. Just cold, official words. The program was being shut down. The bomber was to be stripped. The weapon removed. All records sealed. The crew reassigned. The specialist transferred. And the entire story buried under a classification level so high that even some generals wouldn't see it. The officer who read the message looked furious. He slammed the paper down. "We saved lives with this thing." The specialist didn't argue. He just looked tired. "Sometimes," he said quietly, "the truth is too dangerous to keep alive." And then, the specialist finally revealed his name, not to the public, not to history, only to the officer standing there, a man whose hands had built the most terrifying flying trap in the war, a man who had created a weapon that erased pilots in seconds, a man who understood something darker than physics. That fear is a weapon, too. The officer stared at him, shocked. "You were part of..." The specialist cut him off. "I was part of nothing," he said. "I was used. Just like the plane. Just like the pilots. Just like the dead." He stepped back. Then he said the last line the officer would ever hear from him. "If you ever tell this story, don't tell it like a victory." The bomber was dismantled in secret. The weapon was removed. The parts were scattered. The crew disappeared into other squadrons. The records were locked away. And for decades, nobody spoke about the B-17 that killed 17 fighters in one mission. Because it didn't fit the war people wanted to remember. It wasn't heroic. It wasn't clean. It wasn't noble. It was a trap. And it worked. But here's the part that should haunt you. Not the weapon, not the kills, not the burning planes. The part that should haunt you is this. The Germans were right to fear it. Because once a weapon like that exists, it doesn't stay in one war. It doesn't die. It doesn't vanish. It simply changes names, changes nations, changes uniforms, and waits for the next sky. So the next time you hear a story about a bomber limping home alone, or a fighter squadron that vanished without explanation, or a classified report that was sealed for national security, ask yourself one question. What if it wasn't an accident? What if it was a trap? Because in World War II, there were weapons that didn't just kill men. They killed courage. They killed confidence. They killed the idea that the sky was safe. And somewhere in a locked archive under a file name nobody is allowed to read, there is still a record of one B-17, a plane the Germans couldn't stop. A plane they couldn't understand. A plane they couldn't even admit was real. Until it destroyed 17 aircraft and then disappeared like it never existed.